And I'm going to turn it over to you. As always, if you have questions, please put them into the chat and we will take a break halfway through and Anna will answer questions. And then we'll stop a little bit early at the end and take some questions, and then we can chit chat again if we like at the very end. So Anna, over to you. Oh, and just one thing, please everybody else put yourself on mute or we will do that.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the intro. And Randy had mentioned that to me when we were starting, a few minutes before we started, about this wows and vows business. I'm trying to think, like, could it be that, a native Yiddish speaker would pronounce one the other way or whatever? I was trying to think of something cute about that, but I'm sounding a little bit like a speech impediment, which isn't so cute. So anyway, we're talking about vows and women, pros and cons. Now this, I have to give you a little preamble, as I often do, before we go over to the slides. This is perhaps one of the more legalistic topics, certainly in terms of the title, that we have had so far. In fact, when questions of halacha or law come up, I often defer and say, that's a question for Rabbi Kotler, not for me. So we will be talking about some matters of law today, but it is ancient law that is not applicable today anyway, so I feel more comfortable talking about it. I'm not usurping the role of the rabbi. And also, wait, just lost my train of thought. And also the reason why I'm doing it is to demonstrate something about the role of women in ancient ritual, and to talk about two extraordinary women. Randy or someone, can we make sure that everyone else is muted? Because anytime anyone moves, their face comes up big and it's a little bit distracting for me. So Anna, thank you. Okay, so just like that. And are you able to fix it? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask everybody not to unmute yourselves. So just if you don't mind keeping yourselves muted.
There'll be time to talk later. I look forward to it. Okay, so we are going to talk about two women in particular who I don't think, well, one you might have heard of. It's an obscure story from the Tanakh. Another one I don't think you've heard of. She is from the Mishnah. Interesting story. I'm not going to give anything away just yet, but you'll see when we get to her why we have to talk about vows first in order to have a fuller understanding actually of both of those female characters. But in the meantime, it affords us an opportunity to talk a little about women and ritual in ancient times, which is not something that we usually talk about because there are not that many examples of women in ritual Judaism in ancient times. So with that, we will move on over to the share screen. Anna, do I have permission to share? It's not allowing me to click.
Try now.
Okay, I will try again. Nope.
Okay, 1 second.
When we've practiced before, but sometimes things
try again.
happen. Maybe that way. I'm sorry. Maybe I pressed the wrong one. Okay, here we go. But that might have been my fault. All right. So Vows and Women, the second half of our title was pros and cons. We're going to see some advantages and some disadvantages. You'll see that along the way. Here we're starting with something that you might be familiar with. Okay. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with what we just heard there. Kol Nidre, right? Perhaps one of the most famous prayers in all of Judaism. And yet, I would argue many, many Jews who listen to that prayer don't really know what we're talking about. They know that's something important having to do with high holidays. They probably assume that it has something to do with repentance because, after all, that would be the theme of the high holiday season. In fact, it is very particular about a certain topic, and namely, it is a topic of vows, and which in Hebrew is a neder. Remember, he said kol nidre, all of the vows of, and shavuot is another word that he was about to say, is the plural form for shvuah, which is an oath. So oaths and vows are very closely connected, as we will see. And I think we're going to start with two slides I have here of two quotes from the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks that talks a little bit about the importance of vows and oaths, because that's what we're talking about today. And quite frankly, in regular everyday life, I don't think this is something that generally enters into people's minds nowadays, okay? It certainly doesn't enter into my mind. However, they were very important in ancient and even medieval times for Jewish history. We're going to learn why. And these two quotes from him kind of tie up the idea for us and connect it to Kol Nidre on the night of Yom Kippur. So we know about the emotions, the feelings, the seriousness of the Kol Nidre prayer, but maybe we don't know all the details of it. And that's what we're going to fill in here. So vows and oaths are obligations created by words. Okay, words matter. Everyone hopefully knows that. Unfortunately, not everybody in the world does, but hopefully we all do. They are commitments to do something or refrain from doing something. A vow, our main topic, or in Hebrew, a neder, affects the status of an object. I may vow not to eat something. That something is now for me forbidden food. Now, this isn't the same thing as saying like, oh, I'm not going to eat that piece of chocolate cake because I'm on a diet or something like that. It's much more serious than that. This is a religious vow. An oath, or shvuah in Hebrew, affects the person, not the object. So it's something about my actions, not about what I'm acting upon. What is now forbidden is not the food, but the act of eating it. But both ways, however you handle it, both are binding under Jewish law. Now they're binding, but at certain points, sometimes you want to unbind them. So such is the sanctity of such, well, this is talking a little bit more about the importance of them. The sanctity, the holiness of such undertakings, these vows and oaths, that there are demanding rules that have to be met if they're meant to be annulled. If you don't say otherwise, they're meant to last forever. But, life changes. You might want to end them or annul them, and there have to be very particular ceremonies that you go through in order to annul them. You can't do it yourself. The Parsha, because he's reflecting here on one of the Parshiot in the Torah, sets out some of the ground rules. They're actually written in the Torah itself, but the rest of which are supplied by the oral tradition. There are actually very detailed instructions in the Torah. We're going to see some of them, but it's not enough for real life. For real life, you need the Talmud and things like that to fill in more details. So seriously does Judaism treat verbal undertakings, just saying something or saying something with special formula, that one example of an act of annulment, kol nidre, all of my vows that I have made this past year that I have not fulfilled, please annul them and forgive me, because it's a season of repentance, for not fulfilling them. So that special ceremony takes place on the holiest night of the year. One way of doing the annulment is by participating in this Kol Nidre service. And really high holidays, right? That's the height of importance of the calendar year. So just to show you the severity and importance of vows and annulling vows. So what are vows? It's something we're promising, but in the ancient world, they really took on a certain degree of importance. So first of all, they're not only Jewish. I mean, we're only talking about the Jewish ones, but the concept of vowing was something that was used in the ancient Near Eastern world in general, not only amongst Jews. They had to be fulfilled immediately after the performance of the divine action. So you're asking God to do something for you, and then you have to then, please God, do so and so for me, and then I promise to bring the sacrifice in response. If you get what you ask for, you have to immediately fulfill the vow and give the sacrifice, for example. Now, the next part is really interesting, as you'll see when it comes up with women, even though they often resulted in a public act, because usually you promise to do something that often involves some kind of a ritual that other people would see. They, in fact, were an important part of the private individual's relationship with God. So way back in the biblical times before, when they did sacrifices and they didn't have as many of the prayer services that we have today that evolved later, part of a private kind of interaction, relationship, discussion with God could have come out through a vow. An individual is promising something to God if they're going to get something in advance. And usually that's a very private thing. And yet the what they're promising in response generally is something public, like a sacrifice that would have to be done in a temple. So they're very important, as I mentioned before, even though it's something that's really kind of out of our mindset now. But just to impress on you how important vows were, in addition to what I told you just now, that there are many, many passages in the Tanakh that discuss the details of vows, how to do them, when to do them, why to do them, and what happens if you don't fulfill them. And in fact, it's so detailed that there's an entire tractate, an entire volume in the Talmud that's called Nidarim, or vows, to take care of all of the details. Now, as I mentioned, it's in the Tanakh, and this is really chapter 30 in the book of Numbers is the main kind of site in the Tanakh where the details of whatever details are given in the Tanakh are based on this particular chapter. And so it says here, if a man takes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. Like, this is serious. Don't break it. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. So it's like a promise times, I don't know, 100. Like, it's a lot. It's a big deal. Now, what about women? So sometimes when it says in the Bible that a man has to do something or can do something, it really means men and women, or sometimes it means only men. Sometimes it's up to the rabbis to decide that. But here we have in the Bible itself, in the exact same chapter, a detailed list of 3 different categories of women about whether they can make vows or not. Now, this is very interesting because we're not assuming that ancient Israel, I think everybody knows, we're not assuming that ancient Israel is an egalitarian society. Just like many aspects of Judaism today traditionally aren't an egalitarian society. And yet here we see an opportunity with limitations that women can also take vows. And again, remember, this means that they can reinforce personal relationship with God, and it's acknowledged officially that they can do so. And then it also means that they're going to participate in some kind of public ritual after their vow is fulfilled in order to thank God for fulfilling their vow. So there's it gives women a role in ritual, which is not to be taken for granted in ancient Judaism. So in biblical Judaism. So first category we have is of a girl, someone who's still living in her father's household. So on one hand, I want to say, yay, women. On the other hand, as I said, with limitations. If she's living in a household with a man, then the man does still have jurisdiction, legal jurisdiction over her. And in fact, a girl can make a vow, but her father, under certain conditions, can say, that vow is not standing, and then they don't get in trouble, or it doesn't not counted as a sin if she doesn't fulfill it. So that's of a girl. I'm not going to read all the details. Then we have a wife is actually a similar situation, but not with the father. Here we're talking about with the husband. So a wife can make her own vow, but then if her husband wants to restrict it, wants her to not have that vow, then he can force it not to be enforced. And again, it does not count it as a sin. She doesn't have to keep it. Interestingly, we have a final category here of women living alone. We don't have a general example of single women pre-marriage living alone in biblical times. Just sociologically, it was not a thing. But we do have widows and divorcees, and apparently that they too are allowed to make a vow, to make a formal vow. And of course, there's no man in their life, so that vow then stays. It sticks. So interesting in terms of ritual and women and women's expectation about women's private relationship with God, as well as a public ritual that expresses it. Now we have a very special kind of vow, and we're going to see men and women are equally allowed to take this vow. Again, remember, vows are all voluntary. I mean, once you're in it, but you don't have to make the vow. So even more voluntary is a very special kind of vow called a Nazir or Nazira, the feminine, and it is the Nazarite vow in English. Now, some of you might be thinking right away about Christianity here in this case, because Nazarene, Nazarite, all that stuff. So this is not the same as Nazareth, where Jesus was from, but the concept of a Nazarite vow does appear in the New Testament. We're not talking about that today. And I think very quickly as we continue to talk about it, you'll see why it's something that would maybe have been of interest to the ancient Christians. But we're going to try to stay focused on the Jews. So we find this concept of the Nazir, which is very unique and unusual, also in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar chapter 6. And again, so complicated that there's also an entire tractate or volume of the Talmud devoted to all the details of this, all the what ifs, all the extra details. So the Nazarite vow, in this case, it doesn't say a man can do it. It says right away in one of the first verses, as I highlighted here, that it's something that is an option. Again, this is voluntary for men or women. Very unique in the Bible, actually, that way. And so this is someone then who is taking a vow. So there's all the formality of a vow, but the vow is in this case to consecrate themselves to God, to make themselves holy to God. So, in ancient times, we don't have rabbis, but we have priests and we have Levites. And we have prophets and we have elders and we have judges. Actually, we have a lot of religious leaders, but this in particular, a spiritual kind of, I guess it's not a leader, but someone who wants to devote their lives to spirituality and to God. There was a formal way of doing it, and it involves a certain amount of asceticism, meaning that you have to restrict yourself from certain things. So it's not like a Christian monk who has to restrict himself, go off and live in the desert and not be married and stuff like that. A Nazarite is actually allowed to be married, but they have to refrain from wine, alcohol, anything having to do with grapes. Not cut your hair, and not touch a dead person, not be made ritually impure by a dead person. And it's showing that you have taken yourself and you've set yourself apart. So you're somewhat ascetic. You've restricted things in your life that would be otherwise normal for a Jew and acceptable and applauded for a Jew. And you have decided that you are going to devote yourself to God in this way. It's a very particular type of vow. It's not something that's particularly emphasized. As I said, this is something, if you know anything about early Christians or John the Baptist or anything like that, you would see how this type of asceticism of like restricting yourself from bodily pleasures might be something that you would see in early Christianity. It is not common at all in early Judaism or any types of Judaism. but it exists. So it's kind of nice that the option exists for people that feel extra spiritual, but it is not something that one has to do. There's any expectation one has to do. The most famous Nazarite you might have heard of is, of course, Samson or Shimshon. Samson and Delilah in terms of not cutting his hair and things like that. And we have some few other examples in the Bible, and we're going to get to an example of a woman soon in the time of the Mishnah. So just wanted to mention that, of course, this decision to be a Nazarite is a vow. And so then it is usually for a set amount of time. And so even though it's a private relationship that you have with God to say, I'm going to take a Nazarite vow, as we mentioned before, the end of it is a public ceremony or a public display of your relationship with God. And here, as you can see in all the tiny print, it's not only involves finally cutting your hair, but many, many types of detailed sacrifices that are brought to the temple. So question arises is nowadays, can you even be a Nazarite because there's no temple anymore, so you can't ever end that vow. But we're not going to, because we can't bring the sacrifices, but I'm not going to deal with that now. So I wanted to show you here, oh my, sorry, don't look up, you're going to get dizzy. Okay, show you here an example from the Mishnah about a woman who was a Nazira, okay? And she's a very interesting and special woman. I think it was last time we met, we talked about women who are queens. And I left this one out because I wanted to leave her for today. And also, she's not the queen of a Jewish nation per se, so it's a little bit different. Let's see how this turns out. Excuse me. By the way, I might slip up. Her name is Queen Helene in the English. In many of the Hebrew documents, she's referred to as Helena. So, Helene Hamalka. So I might use either or of the names, excuse me. An incident occurred with regard to Queen Helene, whose son had gone to war, and she said, if my son will return safely, I will be a Nazarite for 7 years. So you can see how this would be seen as a vow, right? That I'm going to decide to become a Nazarite. I promise it. And it's going to be for a time for 7 years. And if God will, return my son safely, then I will do it. So again, private relationship with God, that promise, but then publicly, we'll see how she has to end the Nazarite vow. And her son returned safely from the war, and so she then, fulfilled her end of the bargain with God, and she was a Nazarite for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, she went up to the land of Israel. Okay, so we're going to see in a minute, she actually is not from the land of Israel. We'll see more about that in a minute. And Beit Hillel instructed her in accordance with their opinion that she has to be a Nazarite now for an additional 7 years. So there's a discussion earlier on in the Mishnah between Hillel and Shammai, the famous rabbis, about if you can break your vow or end your vow of being a Nazir if you are outside of the land of Israel, because the ritual involved with breaking that vow are those sacrifices that has to be in the temple in Israel. But could you start the process when you're outside of Israel? Shammai said yes, but Hillel in this case seems to be a little bit stricter, which is unusual. And so they said, well, that's nice. You've been your Nazir for 7 years. Now you've come to Israel to give your sacrifices, but now you haven't really ended it properly. And so you have to be a Nazir for another 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, when she was going to bring her sacrifices, she couldn't because she was ritually impure. And so for whatever other reasons, of course, there's lots of explanations in the Talmud about this, she had to observe another 7 years of being a Nazir, however you pronounce that. And so in the end, it turns out she was probably a Nazir or Nazira for 21 years. And there's a second opinion though, because Jews, different opinions, that she was only for 14 years. But whatever it is, it was a vow that was kept very seriously by this woman, even though it went awry and she had to keep these restrictions longer, she did it anyway. Now, who was this woman? Well, she actually was a queen of Adina Ben. I don't know how to pronounce that actually. I'm very bad at pronouncing that. And she was the wife of Monobazus, king of Adia Ben, which was a Persian province that had its own kingship, though, its own royal family. They were part of the Parthian Empire at the time. This is in 1st century CE, but we're talking about before the year 70. That's when the Second Temple was destroyed. So it all had to happen before that because she brought the sacrifices to the temple. And it turns out you've probably never heard of her before because she didn't start out Jewish. She converted to Judaism with other members of her family. And as you can imagine, there's a few interesting stories about that. Well, how do we know about this Queen Abedine? Certainly from past the time of the Tanakh, and also, how do we know about her? Well, actually, we have 3 different sources that teach us about her. Sometimes they're a little conflicting, but we're not getting into that now. One is the very famous ancient Jewish historian Josephus. He talks about her. Then we have references to her in rabbinic literature. We just saw an example in the Mishnah. And we have archaeology now as well. So let's talk a bit about her role, her relationship to not only the Jewish people, but to Jerusalem per se. She, as we know, as I mentioned, lived in the Persian Empire to the east of Israel, not in Israel. But then she converted to Judaism and felt close to Judaism, and she wanted to make a religious pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and she did so. And she then used her wealth to help the Jews that were living in Jerusalem at the time because it was a famine. She was able to import food from Egypt to help save her now fellow Jews. When her husband is a Tais, and it's also spelled and pronounced differently in lots of different sources, he died. It's unclear if she was still in Jerusalem or not, but we know this is when he died. And she certainly returned home for his death. And at that time, her elder son, Monobazus, was crowned king. And then she died soon after. But her body and her late husband's body, king and queen, were then transferred to Jerusalem, taken to Jerusalem and buried in the royal sepulchre in kind of a palace that she had built while in the city. And this story, of course, is known for, 2,000 years. But sometimes when you hear a story in Josephus or in the Mishnah, you don't always know if it's all completely accurate historically. But now in the digs outside the city walls near the Kotel, if you've ever been there, to the city of David, they have uncovered a palace that they believe was Queen Helene's palace. So this particular woman, this amazing, very pious convert to Judaism, they think they found her palace and they think they have found her sarcophagus. I believe this is when it was on display in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And we see there's a discrepancy here in terms of that's her son's name or her husband's name. There's a lot of different discussions about that in a number of different texts. So according to the rabbis in the Talmud and the Mishnah, that she was not only a convert to Judaism, but that she had 3 real involvements in the in Jewish ritual that became well known. One is that she donated a lamp to the temple, as well as a golden plaque in which was engraved the concept of the biblical episode of the wayward wife of the Sotah, a whole other discussion. But she basically gave tzedakah of giving these beautiful golden donations to the temple. I can't imagine that was cheap. Next, she built and stayed in a grand sukkah that was over 20 cubits high. I'm not exactly sure how high that is, but apparently the rabbis argued about whether or not it counted as a kosher sukkah because it was so high. But then it turns out the rabbis did agree that it was, and the rabbis stayed in it. And of course, she made the Nazarite vow, as we said before. So this seems to be not only a convert to Judaism, but a convert to Judaism who really embraced, Jewish people, tzedakah, taking on the mitzvot and the vow, which is extra, the Nazarite vow, and not only just doing something, but like going above and beyond. Really very, very fascinating story, and a fascinating story that for the most part is seen as exemplary and positive by the rabbis, which doesn't always happen. There were some rabbis that, discussed, could the sukkah have been too high? Who is she? How does she know? Whatever. But there are many positive reports of her in rabbinic literature. So the Nazarite vow actually, which I don't know, I gave it to you again here. I quoted it twice. All right. So there's our discussion of ritual in ancient Israel. I'm going to pause for questions now, in case there are any. And very special position for women in that very unusual ritual. And then talking about a specific example of a woman, a queen, who converted to Judaism, embraced it wholeheartedly, and participated in that ritual as well. The other idea to keep in mind is about the Kol Nidre, that there seems to be some residual, at least, in our Jewish lives and hearts with the Kol Nidre ceremony that kind of retain an aspect of the importance of this ritual. We're going to go on with another interesting woman, but I will pause now. If
The chat has been disabled. If you wanted us to enter questions in the chat, it seems to be disabled for me. I don't know about anybody else.
And I'm happy. If you have a question now, I'm happy to take it. If you want to ask it like this, I'm fine with that.
Are there any other Nazarite women that we know of?
Ooh.
I know I haven't stumped you, Anna.
I am thinking, like, as I said, I have a woman that promised her future son to be a Nazarite. That's Hannah in the temple when she desperately wanted to give birth, and the prophet Eli found her, or the priest Eli found her and thought she was drunk, but really she was praying. And she promised that if she would have a son, that he would be, the word isn't Nazir, but it talks about like not cutting his hair and leading a special life. And that's the prophet Samuel that was born of that. So that's a connection of a woman to a Nazarite. I can't think of any other example. It's an interesting thing that I was thinking about in terms of converts, though, because, there's an expression, I can't remember it. I think in Hebrew it's something like Gerim Kashim Li Yisrael Kitzapachat or something. It's like that. It sounds negative, but don't worry, it's not negative. that converts are difficult for Israel, like almost like a disease, like that painful. But it doesn't mean that converts are bad. God forbid. That's not what it means. What it means is that someone who converts to Judaism, hopefully and ideally, does it with like jumping in like wholeheartedly and so excitedly that in a way that those of us who are born this way, we kind of take it for granted. And when they come in, and sometimes they get like really stringent about their practice, not really then try to, and then other kind of Jews who are born Jews sometimes start feeling guilty around them. Sometimes they can be inspired by them, but sometimes start feeling guilty around them that they've taken like, oh, this convert has come on and taken on this high heights, like of this being a Nazir, and now we feel diminished or guilty that we're not doing the same. Okay, I know that didn't answer your question, but no, I'm racking my brain. I can't think of another example of one, but I can check.
So Anna has written to all of us. You can write your question in, or you can just ask it. But I actually have a question. Why
Please.
did she and her family convert? Do we know?
I think there's some conflicting stories about it, but it had something to do with traveling rabbis, that there were other Jews living in her community. And there were rabbis that traveled and influenced her. We have, interestingly, from around the same time period or a little bit later, of other examples in rabbinic literature, and I can't remember, and in Christian literature too, we're kind of well off, not necessarily queens, but well off Christian or pagan ladies who kind of had a lot of time on their hands. This is sounding a little bit like I don't know, anyway, who had a lot of time on their hands and turns out were smart, shocking. And when there were traveling rabbis that came to town who had interesting things to say, they had servants to take care of everything in the house. And so they went sometimes to attend the lectures or sermons of these traveling rabbis. And sometimes, most of them didn't wholeheartedly convert, but they're kind of like philo Jews, like Jew lovers. And there's some discussion of that. Even the early church fathers, about 100 or 200 years later, complained sometimes to the Christian men in their congregation, saying, "What's going on with your wives? How come they're going to synagogue all the time? Bring them back to church." And so this idea of women searching for intellectual and spiritual fulfillment is kind of found behind the scenes sometimes when you analyze these stories, even though they're written from usually with a very patriarchal lens.
Okay, so there is another question.
Please.
That's what I lost. Aside from, now I lost it. Okay, there it is. Robin wants to know, aside from Nazarite vows or vows about saving lives or committing to the Lord, what would men and women take a vow about? And then part 2, does the Kol Nidre release all vows?
So part 2 is again Rabbi Cutler, but I think nowadays it does release vows because we can't, bring sacrifices to end vows or to perform a ceremony to release the vow. So I think in a post-temple, post-animal sacrifice Judaism, I believe that it does. And then the first part of the question is, what is there something else you would vow for?
Yes.
Well, again, we'd have to, as I said, entire tractate in the Talmud, which I admit I've not read the whole thing. But I assume these are often things having to do with life and death and health, like I said, or fertility. Like I said, this example from the book of Samuel about his mother, Hannah, before he's born, wishing for a child, that trying and not being able to have one for many years, and committing his life to some kind of service to God, including something that looks like being a Nazir. Also, Samson's mother also was infertile for many years, and I think also promised that her son would be a Nazarite. And we're going to see one more example when I start sharing the screen again, about another disturbing story in the Bible that is a man giving a vow, but a woman is involved in it. And in that particular case, it is that he is asking for God to help him in war. He's a leader of in military times, and that if God allows him to beat the enemy, that he will promises to do XYZ. So I think it's for big deals. Like, I don't think it's for something small, because the idea is that it's God is involved, right? So I mean, you can ask God for something, like you can have private prayer. That's not the same as a vow. A vow would be, very specific formula with a very specific kind of a beginning, middle, and end, and it would be something that would be taken very, very seriously. And so I think that ancient people, even though they did use them, I think they used them sparingly, though, for the things that really count.
But it's not something that's done formally today.
So there it isn't. There's also another ceremony that I think it's done accidentally today, or it's like a just in case thing. Not only is there Kol Nidre, which most of us in pre-pandemic times, participated in, but also there's something else that I believe is right before on the afternoon of Erev Yom Kippur, called Hatarat Nedarim, which is a canceling or annulment of nidarim, that there's a tradition in some in Orthodox circles for a man, and maybe actually a woman also, to come before a kind of a temporary Beit Din, a temporary court of 3 men, and kind of also make some kind of recitation in case that they accidentally made any vows over the course of the year, that they should now be removed from any responsibility having to do with them. And that tradition still exists in some communities today, modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. I don't think in the conservative movement. You'd have to ask Rabbi Kopp. So, but I think those are ones that are kind of like just in case. You see, it's just interesting about the power of words too, right? Which is a whole other side topic about really what Rabbi Sachs was talking about in the beginning, the importance of words, words matter, and then how we don't always think about that, right? It's a wonderful lesson in general to make sure we are careful with our words and careful with our promises, and specifically careful with our promises that involve God as well. So I think that's why this thing about the Hatzarat Nidarim that I said in some circles even today is a just in case that we're annulled from them, and similarly with the Kol Nidre prayer. Okay, now I got to get to my other.
We better get back.
Got to get back. Okay,
Thank you, Anna.
here we go. All right. Oh, there we go. So we didn't have any artwork yet today. Here is artwork of this scene. I'm trying to understand it myself. Kind of burn it into your brain if you want to look it up later, by Degas. I had never heard of it before. I have heard of Degas, of course, but not this particular painting before I was preparing for today's class. So after we learned the story about the daughter of Jephthah, in Hebrew it's Yiftach, I'd rather go with that, can be interesting to analyze that picture. All right, here we go. This is from the book of Judges, chapter 11. We've studied the book of Judges already because we learned the amazing stories of Devorah and Yael at some point in our studies together. I think I mentioned at the time the history. I'm going to tell you just very quickly. After the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah, then we have the books of the prophets. The first one is the story of Joshua, which talks about Joshua being the leader after Moses and conquering the land. And the next one is the book of Shoftim, or Judges, where this is taken from. And it's got some crazy stories in it. It has our amazing story of Devorah that we talked about already. It has that Samson and Delilah that you've probably heard of is in this book as well. And it has this story, and it has some other really unusual stories. Basically, at this time, there wasn't one set long-term leader in the land. The land still, there was a lot of wars still going on in the land of Israel as part of the conquering process after Joshua's death. And there wasn't, the leadership changed often or was held by more than one person at the same time. So a very politically unstable time for the Jewish people as they were new inhabitants of the land of Israel after crossing through the desert for 40 years. So one of these leaders, his name is Yiftach, I'm going to say it in Hebrew. He has an interesting backstory. It's not at all like a normal kind of leader that you might imagine. I'm going to skip that though and get right to his vow. As I said, this is a time of political unrest and a lot of military action, a lot of battles. And he is the leader at this time, and he's a military leader. He is going into war against the Ammonites, and he makes a vow to God. And Jephthah made the following vow to the Lord: if you deliver the Ammonites, my enemies, into my hands, then whatever comes out the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering. So it's a promise, God, if you do this for me, I'm making a vow that I will reward you by bringing a sacrifice to you. In this case, it's not at the temple because the temple had not yet been built, but another kind of altar that was in use at the time. So, and it's done in a very formulaic way. And so it is definitely, it's not just like a casual promise, it's a formal vow. Jephthah crossed over into the Ammonites and attacked them. The battle ensued, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. So he, in fact, was successful in battle. When Jephthah arrived at his home in Mitzpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrel and dance, which is a way of celebrating a military victory. She was an only child. To increase the tragedy, he had no other son or daughter. On seeing her,
Okay.
he rent his clothes.
Coming.
Please,
Okay.
please mute yourselves, please.
Go ahead.
Anna, can you please mute people? So he rent his clothes. That means he tore his clothes. This is a sign of mourning, just like it is today when people die, and said, "Alas, daughter, you have brought me low. You have become my troubler. For I have uttered a vow to the Lord, and I cannot retract." A vow is a vow. And the vow was anything that comes across my door as soon as I get back from my successful military battle, I will then sacrifice that thing to the Lord. Now, keep in mind, this is in ancient times. If you were lucky enough to have, rich enough to have your own goat, sheep, chickens, whatever, I mean, they're walking around all the time, right? They're not necessarily kept up in a pen. And so then the idea is that those animals were moving around all the time. And in his mind, he must have thought, like, okay, and the first animal that comes by, that's the one I'm going to sacrifice. But in fact, based on the parameters that he set, it wasn't an animal. It, in fact, was his daughter who had come out to celebrate him in his military victory. So now he said, now I'm in trouble. I now have to do a human sacrifice, which, as I hopefully you know, is absolutely forbidden in Judaism. And he says, I'm stuck. I have to do this because I had promised it to God. Now, interestingly enough, based on what we've talked about before, the question is, does the daughter have her own agency in this particular case? Does she have a voice? Does she have a say? Does she have any of her own power in this story? And interestingly, well, she does have a certain degree of power, perhaps not as much as you might like as a modern, but she has a certain degree. She has a voice, first of all. We'll see what it is. Father, she said, you have uttered a vow to the Lord. Do to me as you have vowed. She has offered herself up now. Seeing that the Lord has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites. She further says, so she's like, okay, that's it. You vowed, take me. I will go willingly to the slaughter. Then she says, so, and this is very interesting, her taking in her very limited amount of power, not only in the patriarchal society of ancient Israel, but also within this very constraining vow that her father made that she has accidentally gotten wrapped up into. She then decides to use her voice to make a certain plan of action, though. Let this be done for me. She's like, okay, I know you're going to have to sacrifice for me, but give me this first. Let me be for 2 months, and I will go with my companions, and it's the female companions, from the Hebrew, and lament, cry upon the hills, and there bewail my maidenhood. I think in some translations it says virginity, even here. The idea is, let us mourn together that I will die a virgin, a young woman. I will never go into marriage. I will never have a long life because you are going to fulfill your vow and kill me. And so she takes this for herself. Also interesting to see here, there seems to be a community of women that she's able to rely on to be sad with her and to help take care of her emotionally. And I would love to see a transcript of their discussions over these 2 months or to learn more about what they did. Unfortunately, the Bible is silent for us on that. Go, he replied. He let her go for 2 months, and she and her companions went and bewailed her maidenhood upon the hills. After 2 months' time, in fact, she came back. She returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. She had never known a man. She was young. She was a virgin. So it became a custom in Israel for the maidens of Israel to go every year for 4 days in the year and chant dirges, sad songs, for the daughter of Yiftach the Giladi. Now, it's a very interesting idea. In the end, it makes it sound like a whole tradition, a whole custom, a whole holiday might have evolved from this horrific situation. In fact, in all of biblical and rabbinic literature or any other literature, there's no evidence whatsoever that this was ever formalized into a type of, fast day, feast day, commemoration in any manner, shape, or form. Of course, I think we've talked about before in terms of folk customs and women and, ideas that might have been passed down orally. There's a chance that this might have continued for a few generations or even more, but if it has been lost to us. So it's a very, very tragic story. I will tell you that the rabbis read closely into this verse 39 that I'm leaving on the screen for you to see that it doesn't actually say he killed her. Like the words don't appear that she was sacrificed or that her father killed her. And there are some rabbis and some commentaries, traditional commentaries, that want to take that as proof that in fact this human sacrifice was never actually carried out, that the silence of they read into the silence in the text that it never actually happened, because it is so, horrific for them to imagine it at all. And they say that it didn't happen and somehow she disappeared or she went off and lived in those hills the rest of her life. She never knew a man. She lived some kind of solitary lifestyle. There's a few different explanations, but it's really reading into the text, which after all is what we do all the time. But the explicit text itself does make it sound like the sacrifice did happen. So, we've talked about the concept about patriarchy quite a bit. And so I think it was really interesting to reflect on in the case of this story about Yiftach's daughter, that she certainly was in a patriarchal system. Her father had complete control over her, so much so that he could even, end up accidentally, but even so, involving her in a vow so that he would end up taking her life. But she is allowed to, you would think that she would have no power whatsoever and just be silent, because we do have we have plenty of women in the Bible who are actually silent, but she uses her words and her action and her small community group of women in order to assert a certain amount of power for herself to fulfill something for herself before she actually agrees to have her life taken. There's just one other thing I wanted to add, though, is that throughout rabbinic literature, Yiftach is seen as a bad guy. And I think it's important for us to understand that, or stupid or bad, because there's no way that the rabbis would endorse human sacrifice, even if it's part of a vow, and even if it involves only a girl. And as a matter of fact, the rabbis in the Midrash and otherwise in other places often say, there could have been ways he could have gotten out of it. You can get out of the vow. You can annul it, right? We have, like we said, Kol Nidre in our case. In their case, sometimes if you were dedicating an animal for a sacrifice, you don't have to necessarily give the animal. You could give what the animal is worth in money. And very often you would have to, because if you promise an animal, it would turn out that the animal was ritually impure and you couldn't give a ritually impure sacrifice. And so you would give the monetary value instead. So all the more so, something like that would have been appropriate here. And so the rabbis, without exception, say that Yiftach was wrong in this case, that he was either just evil or stupid, that he didn't know how to fix this horrible, horrible situation, or that he didn't go to the leaders of his time, the religious leaders of his time, to ask for help. And so there's a lot of ways to look at the story, but I think it's also interesting to hear the voice of that young woman coming through and what she asked for and what her immediate community of other young women felt with her, and then perhaps for a time after her death as well. So I would imagine there's some questions.
So
What's
there
our
is
other-
there's one question I saw, which is, what's the difference between a vow and a promise?
Right. So as I said, a vow is like a promise times 100 or something. So it's ritually legally, because from the rabbi's perspective, there's no difference, right? Like if it's legal, it's ritual. If it's ritual, it's legal. Ritually, legally enforced promise, and that involves usually, at the very least, God's name, if not direct connection to, yeah, it involves God as well. And there's usually a formality to it. But like I said, in terms of like language and formula of language, but as I said before, just in case we want to be extra careful that we don't break any of those laws, that's why we have something like Kol Nidre and that other Hatarat Nidarim that I mentioned before to cover us just in case.
And then Bernard wants to know, why are we never told Yiftach's daughter's name?
Right. So names in general and what we know about names and what they mean is a fascinating concept in the Bible altogether. Sometimes names are supplied for us in Midrashim if they're not given in the Bible itself. There is a late medieval Midrash that supplies the name of the daughter as being Shayla, but I've only ever seen it in an English article describing it. So I'm not even sure how it's spelled in the Hebrew, if it's with an aleph or an ayin. But actually there could be a lot of ways of spelling that in Hebrew, and that probably would have a deeper meaning to it. I should probably research that. But I think it's interesting in terms of, what matters, or not what matters, who matters or who doesn't, right? From the perspective of the story, the way it appears in Sefer Shoftim, it's basically a book that follows different leaders and what happened to them. Like they're the stars of the story of each chapter or groupings of chapters. And then there's other incidental characters. So interestingly, we did learn Yael's name, even though she's more incidental, I guess, to Devorah. But she had a tremendous amount of power in her story in that she killed Sisera. So this woman is definitely if you look at the arc, I mean, I don't want to say she's incidental. It sounds horrible. And just from her story, she's absolutely not. But if you looked at the arc of the whole book, then I think that she is much more of an incidental character. And as I said, even that she uses her voice at all, and it's recorded in the Bible in terms of expressing her desire to help her father fulfill his vow, which I'm assuming comes out of respect for parents and respect for God, but in an overreaching way, like not in a way that would be expected or usual in Judaism. Just like a Nazir also is not the normal way to, be with God, but this is not a Nazir. But the fact that she and other women that she relates to are even mentioned, and that their actions and memorializations of her are even discussed, it sounds horrible to say, but it's really true that it's really quite amazing that we know even that much about it, based on generally how many biblical stories are told, with the focus being on, the man and his father.
Okay, I wonder if anybody else has a question. Anybody else want to jump in with a question?
I do want to sum up this story, this idea, because this was a tough one, but I thought it was really important because I wanted, Beverly, I'll get to you in 1 second. I just want to kind of sum up a little bit here, because these were some tough ideas. But I thought that they were important because I really wanted to teach you about this Queen Helena of Aberdeen, because I wanted you to see the spectacularness of her, choice of conversion and how committed she was to her Judaism. And I thought that was a fascinating story. And then this story about Yiftach and his daughter, I mean, you have to know that story. Like, it's not like oh, great, we found an amazing heroine in the Bible to look up to. Although you can find things to look up to in her, but the whole story is so problematic that it can make us feel uncomfortable. But I think that in order to understand who we are as Jews and the whole Bible, including the uncomfortable stuff, especially the uncomfortable stuff that have to do with women, I think it's important for us to know it. So when I was thinking about those two stories and the commonality of the idea of vows, and then I thought it was important to outline the importance of the ancient personal relationship having to do with vows, and then of course how we connected to Kol Nidre. So I took something uncomfortable and I recognize that in order to expand our minds, but also to hopefully make some connection to our hearts as well. That was my goal. Now, Beverly, did you have a question? She typed something. Okay, I will open the chat. Here we go. Right, so we answered the first one. Vow and promise, you did that one. What compelled the daughter to return? And not to flee. So that one, this is from Jeff. What compelled the daughter to return and not to flee, knowing that her life was in peril? Would the father have killed her? Would have been killed if he did not follow through with his vow. So I don't think the father would have been killed, by a judicial body or anything, but I'm sure he would have believed that he would have been punished by God, which might have involved death. Why didn't she run? I think we have to go back to the idea of the patriarchal society, and in a very horrible, perverted way, that the story might be a way of demonstrating absolute fidelity to and respect for fathers, parents, and God. That even though that she, in a sense, she didn't sacrifice herself, but she agreed, she wholeheartedly, or not wholehearted, she agreed, she consented to be sacrificed in this way. So I think it's probably supposed to be a demonstration of, ultimate respect for authority in a patriarchal system. And then why? Okay, so I think I saw all the questions. But
Beverly's still
Beverly,
waving.
did she have a question?
Beverly, can you unmute?
Yeah, she could unmute. Oh, on the top. Oh, she asked me a question. I never got that map you showed us a few weeks ago.
Oh,
I don't know which map that is. Do you mean the timeline? Timeline? No? Yes, the timeline. The timeline. Okay, I think that's what she means. Okay, I will look that up in a minute. But I see hands are up though. Okay, Effie, is that your name? Did you want to unmute?
Etty.
Etty. Mm-hmm. Does she know how to unmute? Oh,
Etty,
she doesn't have permission to unmute, maybe. Anna, does everyone have permission to unmute now, please?
Yeah,
It might have been.
everybody should be
That's
able
the
to unmute.
problem.
Etty, can you
Okay,
unmute?
how about now?
Now they
You don't
can't
have a
though.
question?
Yeah.
There we go.
I
Yay,
have an observation rather than a question.
please.
In the Kol Nidre that you showed us,
Yes.
was only one Torah out. When we do Kol Nidre, all the Torahs come out of the Aron.
I don't know. I don't know if that was a real Kol Nidre or if it was just for show. I'm not sure. I wanted the music because I wanted to pull at heartstrings a little bit in that way, which I know that Kol Nidre does for all of us in different ways, because I don't think that many of us think about the legality of vows, and then maybe next year we will now. And also, it was a way also of making something a little bit emotionally present, even though this is a topic that could maybe seem, very old and not relevant, to demonstrate the ongoing relevance to at least to a certain extent.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to talk, but the chat was disabled and I couldn't unmute because the host didn't unmute me. So I was like flipping my hands around trying to get your attention, but I couldn't do anything. And yes, it was the timeline that you had
Okay.
before. That you were
I'm
gonna
looking
share.
for it again, but then you'll have to enable the chat for me, Anna, so that I can include it if I can type it in, I mean.
I don't know what's happening with the chat today. I'm sorry.
Or you can email it to me. I can give you my email, or maybe other people want it. I don't know.
Okay, I found it again. So if the chat is disabled,
No, it should be.
all right, well, it's not
How
working. So
about
anyway,
try now?
yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, here we go. www.odyeda.com. I'm going to double check it first. I'm clicking it on my phone to make sure it's the right thing. It is. Okay, that's where it is.
Okay. Susie, you have a question.
I did have a question. Anna, thank you for your presentation. It really did get under my skin, and you were very effective in giving us troublesome things to think about. What I find, yeah, I find it interesting that, I mean, I would really like to see this particular story expanded upon. It seems like there was no judicial council, there was no assistance for the young daughter. If Jephthah was a madman, a bad man,
Right.
there was no justice served. And you prefaced this presentation by saying that human sacrifice was absolutely forbidden. So
Right.
How was it that this could have been justified? And maybe that's not for today, maybe that's for another time. But
No,
it
I
just
think it's
feels
a
like
great
it's
question.
it's a little
It's a good
snapshot.
question. I think that part of it has to do with, again, the whole what's going on in Jewish history at the time in the book of Judges. It's sometimes I've heard it described as kind of the wild, wild west. It's a time before there's a real settling down and a formal establishment of a political system where we would like to see there to be justice upheld, or a political system that would, insist on on justice being upheld. So it's sometimes changed very quickly by generation as to what was going on. As I said, also, it was a time of a lot of military action, which also leads to chaos and kind of unstable leadership, and therefore unstable systems of justice. So I might be trying to excuse it, but I think that from a biblical history perspective, that was going on. And I think that it's really important to remember that, again, I'm pretty sure without exception that every rabbinic commentary comes down on your side, not on Yiftach's side, on saying basically he could have come up with some kind of solution. Some kind of an ad hoc court that could have annulled him of his vow if he couldn't otherwise, or as I said, he could have come up with a monetary substitute, or he could have any number of things. So the rabbis are not pleased with this story, but
Well, at the
there
time of-
are other stories like stories like that we learned, I don't know if you're with us, the first session of rapes, the rape of Tamar,
Yes.
the rape of Dinah, things like that. Like those are also horrible and disturbing stories. And so I guess the question is, why do these exist in the Bible altogether? I think this falls into that grouping.
Mhm.
So, you can
wasn't it
it's not, so that's the bigger question, and there isn't any one answer to it. Sometimes, I mean, you can certainly say that you can learn a lesson from a negative story, in order to see what not to do, just as much as a lesson from a positive story that would be as a positive like role model in terms of how to act. So certainly in terms of what not to do, I mean, this is a perfect example about being rash with or extreme with religious ideas that might come to that if you're not careful can lead to disaster. So certain ideas about extremism in religion and all religions, you could see that, that often end up leading to violence. This amongst other stories in the Bible could be seen as a warning sign about that.
Wasn't it the time of judges and they had judges there? Wouldn't the judges have said
Right.
anything, or-
So that's a good thing about judges versus judicial system.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying in terms of the kind of immature, politically, systematically immature leadership systems that existed. Clearly, either were not in place enough that Yiftach would have utilized them. Like that's the way of saying like, well, he was silly or stupid, or like some rabbinic approaches would actually put him in the category of being bad or evil, that like he could have done it and he chose not to,
Right.
which they deem a huge error on his part.
Because the Jews asked God for judges and he gave them judges, and then
Well, I think that you're thinking about kings. Certainly they asked God
maybe
for a
kings.
king.
Okay, maybe
Right.
kings.
And that's a little bit later on in history.
Okay.
And as we learned about when we talked about queens last time, that didn't always turn out so well either.
Right.
That's the other message too about Judaism, that that our leaders are human and they mess up and they make mistakes. One of my teachers used to say to me, our ancestors are not, we don't emulate our ancestors in a way to call them saints like they do in Christianity. That we understand that our ancestors were human and made mistakes. And if we're told stories about them, then we're meant to learn from those mistakes. All
Okay,
right, so I see more questions. Oh my God.
and I think we're going to take
Yes.
one more because of the time.
Yeah.
I think this one is fascinating. And Robin says, was Gilead in this story typical of how women were controlled in ancient Israel? Could this story be why The Handmaid's Tale calls
Oh,
the extreme controlled U.S. society Gilead?
I don't know. I never thought about that.
I
But
wondered.
certainly in terms of power and extreme patriarchal systems, it's strange because in the same book we have Devorah, who was a judge in her time, but she's the only one in that whole kind of arc of that whole era in Jewish history. And she obviously was an anomaly. And in that case, the rabbis very often disparage her. They don't like that there's a female leader. That's
Of course.
but it's nice now, equal opportunity, though the rabbis disparage Yiftach for doing
Yeah.
bad. It's not only the women, but as I said, I don't remember where, but I saw it described as the time of kind of the wild, wild west, where in order to have any kind of control whatsoever, it was, kind of military, patriarchal control. So I guess that would be in comparison to something like The Handmaid's Tale.
I've
Have
always
to
wondered.
ask. Let's bring in Margaret Atwood and ask
That's
her.
right. For next week. Okay, Carol, over to you.
Anna, we want to thank you again for a tough one to listen to and try to pull together. But I think that's part of what this is to stretch us a little bit and not just certainly tell us what we already know, and to leave us questioning, which you have. Just reminding everybody, next week, April 28th, we're discussing strength and mothers. It's our second last one, so we're enjoying these. And I'm just going to put a plug in for a program that's coming up on May 13th, Thursday, from 1 to 2 with Marcia Fenwick. She's a nutritionist, and we've titled it, Have Your Cake and Eat It Too. So watch for some advertising and sign up for it. And certainly come back next week at 2 o'clock for Our Anna. Thank you.